October 1962. The world held its breath. The air was thick with tension and the silence was deafening. People everywhere were glued to their radios and televisions, waiting for any news, any sign of hope or despair. An unprecedented fear gripped nations and their people. It was a fear that transcended borders, languages, and ideologies. The fear of annihilation, of everything they knew and loved being wiped out in an instant. The reason? The Cuban Missile Crisis. A standoff that brought the world to the edge of the abyss, a confrontation that could have ended life as we know it. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stood on the brink of nuclear war. 13 days of excruciating tension, where every moment felt like an eternity. It was a confrontation unlike any other, a chilling glimpse into the abyss of global destruction. The stakes were nothing less than the survival of the human race. The discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, sent shockwaves through the American government and public. The proximity of these weapons brought the threat of nuclear war to America's doorstep. This wasn't just about Cuba, it was about the balance of power, about vulnerability, about survival. It was a stark reminder of how fragile peace can be and how quickly it can be shattered. The very existence of humanity hung precariously in the balance. The decisions made in those 13 days would determine the fate of millions, if not billions, of lives. The world watched in horror as two superpowers, armed with unimaginable destructive power, engaged in a deadly game of chicken, each side waiting for the other to blink, knowing that a single misstep could lead to catastrophe. The stakes had never been higher. The potential for destruction was beyond comprehension, and the margin for error was razor thin. Each decision, each word uttered by President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev carried the weight of the world. Their leadership, their ability to navigate this crisis, would be tested like never before. The possibility of a nuclear exchange, once unthinkable, became a terrifying reality. The world had never been closer to the brink of nuclear war, and the consequences of such an event were unimaginable. Families huddled in fear, contemplating the unthinkable. Parents held their children close, trying to shield them from the harsh reality of the world outside. Communities came together, finding solace in each other's company. The doomsday clock, a symbol of global catastrophe, ticked closer to midnight than ever before. It was a stark reminder of how close humanity had come to the edge, and how fragile our existence truly is. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a wake-up call, a moment that forced the world to confront the terrifying reality of nuclear war and the need for diplomacy, understanding, and peace. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not a sudden eruption but the culmination of years of Cold War tensions. The ideological battle between the United States and the Soviet Union had been simmering since the end of World War II, with both superpowers vying for global influence and dominance. This period, known as the Cold War, was marked by a series of confrontations, proxy wars, and a relentless arms race. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, intended to topple Fidel Castro's communist regime in Cuba, had humiliated the United States and pushed Cuba further into the arms of the Soviet Union. The invasion, orchestrated by the CIA, involved a group of Cuban exiles who landed on the island with the hope of inciting a rebellion. However, the operation was a disaster, resulting in a swift defeat and a significant embarrassment for the Kennedy administration. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity in Cuba. By placing nuclear missiles on the island, he could bolster Soviet defenses, deter a potential US invasion of Cuba, and most importantly, gain leverage in the global balance of power. The strategic placement of these missiles would not only protect the communist ally, but also serve as a counterbalance to American missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy, which were within striking distance of the Soviet Union. For Kennedy, the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba was intolerable. It shifted the strategic balance, putting the US within range of a devastating nuclear strike. The discovery of these missiles through aerial reconnaissance photos sent shockwaves through the American government, leading to intense deliberations on how to respond. The stakes were incredibly high, as any misstep could lead to a nuclear war. He declared a naval blockade of Cuba, vowing to prevent the arrival of further Soviet weaponry and demanding the removal of the existing missiles. This blockade, referred to as a quarantine to avoid the implications of an act of war, was a bold move. It was a direct challenge to the Soviet Union, signaling that the US was prepared to take drastic measures to ensure its national security. The world watched as US warships took up positions in the Caribbean, prepared to intercept and search Soviet vessels. The tension was palpable, with both superpowers on high alert. The US Navy was ready to enforce the blockade, while Soviet ships continued their journey towards Cuba, carrying the potential for a catastrophic confrontation. The tension was palpable. A single miscalculation, a single spark, could ignite a global conflagration. The world held its breath as diplomatic channels buzzed with urgent communications. Behind the scenes, intense negotiations were underway, with both sides seeking a way to de-escalate the situation without losing face. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains one of the most dramatic and perilous moments in modern history, a stark reminder of the thin line between peace and nuclear war. The crisis reached its peak in late October 1962, a time when the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a defining moment in the Cold War, a confrontation that brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the edge of catastrophe. Kennedy and Khrushchev, two men with the fate of the world in their hands, engaged in a tense standoff. Their decisions in those critical days would determine the course of history as they navigated the treacherous waters of international diplomacy and military brinkmanship. Through diplomatic channels and public pronouncements, they played a high-stakes game of chess, each move fraught with peril. Every decision, every statement was carefully calculated to gain an advantage without triggering a devastating conflict. The stakes could not have been higher, as both leaders sought to avoid a nuclear war while maintaining their respective nations' honor and security. Kennedy, determined to project strength and resolve, addressed the nation on television, outlining the gravity of the situation and the steps he was taking to address it. His speech was a masterclass in leadership, as he calmly but firmly explained the threat posed by the Soviet missiles in Cuba and the measures the United States would take to remove them. His words resonated with a mixture of fear and determination. The American public, gripped by anxiety, listened intently as their president assured them that every possible step was being taken to protect their safety and prevent a nuclear disaster. Khrushchev, initially defiant, sent mixed signals, alternating between conciliatory gestures and bellicose threats. His strategy was to keep the Americans off balance, to make them uncertain of his next move. This unpredictability added to the tension, as the world watched and waited to see how the Soviet leader would respond to the American demands. The world held its breath, uncertain of his true intentions. Would he back down and remove the missiles, or would he push the confrontation to its breaking point? The uncertainty was palpable, as nations around the globe braced for the possibility of a nuclear exchange. Behind the scenes, frantic diplomatic efforts were underway. Diplomats and advisors worked around the clock, seeking a resolution that would satisfy both sides and avert disaster. The stakes were incredibly high, and the pressure on those involved was immense. Secret back channels were opened, messages exchanged, and concessions explored. These covert communications were crucial, as they allowed both sides to negotiate without the glare of public scrutiny. Through these channels, tentative agreements were reached, and the groundwork for a peaceful resolution was laid. The pressure was immense, the risk of miscalculation ever present. One wrong move, one misinterpreted signal could have led to a catastrophic escalation. Yet through careful diplomacy, both Kennedy and Khrushchev managed to navigate the crisis, ultimately reaching an agreement that saw the removal of the Soviet missiles from Cuba and the easing of tensions between the two superpowers. For 13 long days and nights, the world teetered on the precipice of nuclear war. The threat was real, the fear palpable. People everywhere grappled with the unthinkable, the possibility of a nuclear holocaust. In the United States, bomb shelters were hastily prepared, and schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills, a chilling reminder of the potential consequences. The airwaves crackled with news bulletins, each update raising the anxiety level another notch. In the Soviet Union, a similar sense of dread prevailed. Citizens, accustomed to Cold War rhetoric, now faced the terrifying prospect that it could escalate into nuclear Armageddon. The world held its breath, praying for a peaceful resolution. But as the days turned into nights and the crisis deepened, hope seemed to dwindle. While the world watched with bated breath, A different kind of drama unfolded behind closed doors. Secret negotiations, conducted through back channels and clandestine meetings, sought to find a way out of the impasse. One crucial channel was the hotline, a direct phone link between the White House and the Kremlin, established in the wake of the crisis to facilitate communication and prevent misunderstandings. Through these back channels, Kennedy and Khrushchev could communicate directly, bypassing the formal diplomatic channels and the glare of publicity. These secret exchanges proved critical in diffusing the crisis. Concessions were made, compromises reached, and ultimately, a deal was struck that averted a nuclear catastrophe.